Could be. Let's see.
We're just muted,
I'm
right?
going to be listening. I'm only going to be listening because I'm putting my son down and I have my headphones in.
Oh, we understand. Okay. Thank you for multitasking and participating tonight. Much appreciated.
Of course.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank
All
you.
right. Great. Okay. So yes, we do have 13 people in the room.
They just haven't unmuted yet.
Some of them, yeah, some of them haven't unmuted, which is okay. Unmuting is a good signal to me that you want to talk. And feel free to be on video or not. It seems like most people don't want to, but that's okay. Maybe they're eating dinner. How about you, Ruth and Kevin? Have you had your dinner?
We've had our dinner. It was delicious.
Okay, good.
It was Redwood night at Amy's. So we went and supported the local community and the high school in one shot.
Oh, love it. Okay. That sounds, now you're making me hungry. And I can see that Chief Weber just took a quick bite. He took a quick bite too, didn't he? There we go. All right. Well, again, thank you for participating, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. First off, since I think we have Joe with us, are there any burning questions of clarification, anything that you feel you need to know in order to weigh in on the 3 questions?
Carolyn, I really felt like the presentation focused on a building, like even option B, the new service model, assumed that we would have paramedics in Ross. And if we can move those services outside the community and still have a response time that's only 2 minutes greater, but is within a reasonable standard of care, I'm not sure why we're kind of hyper-focused on putting a new building up one way or another. It seems that we're putting a new building in within a mile of other buildings that do the same thing. So there's quite a bit of redundancy within a short geographical span, within Ross Valley to cover those services for our community.
Yes. Okay. When you put that question in the chat, I thought you were talking more about the fire service, which was that option B. But Joe, why aren't we considering paramedic services coming from our neighboring towns, or Chief Weber?
Yeah, we certainly could. I guess the thought and just some preliminary, but that certainly, as I said, is obviously
right on cue.
Yes, it is the thought.
There you go. Off to San Anselmo.
There we go. Yeah, it's going that direction.
Yeah, it's going out.
Hard to know which, or it could be going to Winship, or down to San Anselmo. So, that is an option. And I think the preliminary, as I said, that was one of the 4 options. We trying to boil it down, but certainly if that is an option, the medical calls are, as Chief Weber could probably answer this question. Obviously, there's a lot more medical calls, way, way more. I think those numbers, if I recalled, 90%, 260 of the calls in 2 years have been medical. So,
Chief, do you have a sense for what percentage of our medical calls are to Cedars alone?
Cedars, not as many as it's pretty random and scattered. When we looked at the call, the number of incidents and stuff across and on a visual map, and we're happy to share our standards of coverage. There isn't, as you'd expect where your center bases are in activity, there's more hits, if you will, but Cedars wasn't a large number.
Okay.
Okay, that's good. All right. I see a couple people off mute. Ken is one of them. Ken?
Sure. I have 2 questions. One, when you said burning questions, was that an intended pun or was that just
So sorry.
My more serious question has to do with the time delay from 8 to 10 minutes. And I wonder if there are any studies, and you may not have them at your fingertips, that show how important it is to the service that you're providing. For example, if someone has broken a leg, getting there in 8 minutes versus 10 minutes doesn't matter. But if it's a stroke, I guess every minute counts. And so I'm wondering if there's any kind of statistics, not in Ross, but maybe in more general medical or fire literature that would address how important every minute is. And I'm also guessing that, for example, if there's a difference between 1 minute and 3 minutes, that might be a difference than between 28 and 30 minutes. So it not only is the length of time, but it's where you are on that curve. So there's a lot of questions for you to you know.
So when we separate the two and look at fire specifically, fire in a structure that's free burning doubles in size just about every minute. So it's exponential growth, right? And you know, that curve we look at to see when free burning goes into now from, you know, a free burning or incipient fire to the room is flashes or becomes fully involved. You know, is there anywhere in that under 10-minute mark? And so when we look at that suburban response, when I mentioned a suburban response, and that, you know, moving to 2 minutes higher puts you on kind of the outer edge of a suburban response, kind of looking at what standard expectations are of communities. And, you know, there is a very low volume of fires. The socioeconomics, demographics of Ross, you know, this isn't a community in crisis like some of the metropolitan cities, so that occurrence is less. Then you look at, you know, 1/5 of your houses have sprinkler systems in, that would negate that fire growth. When you switch over and look at the medical side, you know, that varies greatly depending on the type of incident. So a cardiac arrest, when the heart has stopped, you know, the difference between 7 and 9 minutes without action is probably negligent. It's that when we can get somebody there or a bystander CPR started, we're very effective within that under 10-minute window with a survival rate. But that would count on somebody starting CPR. And that first arriving unit then defibrillating, which is the definitive care needed. So when we looked at this and we looked at, you know, the fire incidents that occurred in that 2-year period, would there have been substantial change or outcome? When we looked at those incidents, the answer was no. Almost inevitably, when a community makes this decision, there's some event that occurs right after that doesn't necessarily fall into the standard. And I think the community would have to understand and expect that, you know, but that would be an anomaly generally. So we look at things in the general tense, and, you know, moving the paramedic services out. I think the reason why we put this option in front of you was in preliminary discussions with residents, others, and similar to what you saw on the vote tonight, that's of significant concern for the majority of the residents. So, you know, taking that out of a conventional structure under that public safety building standards and other things, and into a modular unit on the same site was a way to accomplish that at a substantially less cost than, you know, adding that square footage that would be needed to that primary building and building under those standards, which, you know, a fire station, and I shake my head because I can't believe it either, but you're looking at, you know, $1,500 to $2,000, north of $2,000 probably dollars a square foot for construction right now. So it's expensive.
But can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure,
So
Ken.
I presume that you have pretty good retrospective records. So for example, you could tell me in 2019, how many of the calls were strokes and how many were cardiac arrests and so on, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So, and I'm also guessing that the numbers that you quoted, 7 or 8 minutes, is sort of I forget, is it an average or a maximum?
So 7 minutes and 55 seconds was an average. It wasn't
Average, okay. So what would be really interesting then, because you have the data to know whether, you know, Mrs. Smith on Berry Lane had a heart attack and Mr. Jones on Laurel Grove had a stroke, to actually retrospectively, and I don't think it's a lot of work because there's not that many of these types of incidents. Go back, and because there's so few incidents, I would suggest going back at least 5 years. Calculate how long it took to get to that particular incident and how long it would have taken if you move the fire station to San Anselmo, and see what the increment is. And then we can have some kind of sense for how likely a change and how significant it is. Because for me, when I hear that there's 2% of 300 incidents and it's, you know, average of 8 minutes, I can't really make sense of it. But if I see that there's, you know, only one heart attack and it might not have made a difference, I have a more sympathetic view to moving things.
Yeah.
Is that something that you can do?
We would be challenged with outcome data. You know, what a call is dispatched as is often in the computer automated dispatch system comes in as a heart attack. It may not be a heart attack. It may be the person was having indigestion. So going back, having an outcome out of the hospital would be the challenge for us. So we use the call type to dictate those calls, right? Because we don't have outcomes of discharge outcomes, that would present the challenge. So the information we have is what's based on the original call type. We could go back and try to do some additional analysis, look at 5 years. When we talked to Citygate, who did this work for us, you know, the volume of incidents when you talk about like fire, specifically those three, the numbers are low enough that, you know, you could have 7 the next year and then you say it doubled. But, you know, you have the 5-year trend, I don't think will tell us a lot more, but we can certainly dig into some of the data and look at some of the outcome stuff. I can work with our EMS chief for that.
Yeah, I'm happy with, by the way, I'm happy with 10-year if you prefer, if you think that would be more instructive than 5
More
years.
instructive, yeah, just in case there's an outlier.
And by the way, you can, you know, very heavily caveat it with all the types of things that you're talking about, because I know it won't be perfect. But I think at least it'll be more tangible and people will be able to understand what they're willing to pay for or not pay for.
Yes, thank you, Ken. It's a great suggestion. Okay, let me ask for a volunteer reporter and get that business out of the way so that that person can start taking some notes. I am taking notes as well, but I'd love for one of you to report back to your neighbors. Anybody? How about you, Marcia?
Are you talking to me? I'm Marcia.
Sorry, Marcia.
It's just in case there's a Marcia on the phone.
No, thank you, Marcia.
I'll take notes.
Will you?
I'll take notes.
And
Yeah.
report back? Okay, great.
Yes.
And
Who do I
don't
report back to? When you say report back, who do I report back to?
That's to the large group once we reconvene out of the breakout group.
Okay.
You just have to give maybe 3 or 4 or 5 highlights from the conversation. Don't feel like you have to take detailed notes because I'm doing that and we're recording.
Okay.
So
Okay,
thank
great.
you. I really appreciate it. And I didn't mean to pick on you. It's just that there's so many
There I
people
am.
starting and you hadn't spoken yet. All right, so let me pose the questions because I want to get through all 3 of them if we can. The first one is, what is your vision for the new Civic Center? It says building, but you know, the programming of the Civic Center, the community identity, those kinds of comments. We don't have to get into architectural style or, you know, anything specific to the building, but in particular the programming and anything about the identity of the space. Comments?
Well, first, I think it's interesting you guys have rebranded it as the Civic Center because I don't know anybody in town who's ever called it that. It's the firehouse, it's town hall, it's the police station, but now calling it the Civic Center certainly makes it much grander. So, you know, congratulations on the rebranding. You know, secondly, I don't think of that as our town center or really part of our heritage. I think of Natalie Coffin Green as part of our town center. I think of our common area as the town center. You know, I think there are other areas that we gather and that we think of as crucial to the town. MAGC is perhaps one of our, you know, our cultural heritage sites. But there's really no gathering, there's no community around the Civic Center to believe that that's our town center or culturally significant, at least in my mind. The buildings are pretty, right? They're historical, but we want to do away with those. So, I think it's a little, I guess, ambitious to think of it as culturally significant to the town of Ross.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that.
Kevin,
That's
I totally agree.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other comments? Let me see who's Frank.
You've got Frank, but it's really Diane and Frank.
Okay, great. Thanks.
I just wondered, you said what is our vision, but with a change or with a rebuild, what is the town thinking about? Would we be different about the way we operated? Because it's hard to say what is your vision without having any content to wrap around that.
Yes, and you know, really, the main question on the table is where do we locate fire service, paramedic service? Those are the kind of drivers of the programming of it, because obviously you have to have the police station in town. You have to have your administrative buildings. You need some space for those folks to work, although we're all working from home now practically. But yeah, so your point is well taken that maybe the vision question is a little soon. Any other thoughts on that one? Then we can move to the big questions.
Actually, I just want to just weigh in on what Ken was saying and the looking back, et cetera, incidents, because I think when you're looking at simply arithmetical 2% change, that doesn't make much difference to people. What does that really turn out to be? And you know, what would we lose by losing these? There's been some conversation about, you know, the truck won't be here. I mean, the paramedic won't be here. Also, I don't know if in the future that means any kind of reduction in paramedic services or in fire services as far as vehicles and things are concerned, if we're absorbed somewhere else. And the assumption also is that if you call from one place and say they can come from San Anselmo, that the paramedic truck is there, or the fire truck is there and ready and available to come. So I don't know, Ken, how you might fold that into a more eloquent way of saying, gathering more information. But I think that's important, because otherwise you go, oh, what's a 2-minute difference? You know, what is that? But it doesn't, at least if I was listening to the chief properly, it doesn't really, in terms of a fire, it isn't 2 minutes, it's exponential. And when you're talking about exponential differences, that's a lot.
As we've seen with the virus.
Yeah.
I have one comment on the vision. So I moved here in '94. I moved from very far away, and you know, one of the main reasons I moved here was for the school district. But I also remember going through the process and hearing people say, "Oh, you've got your own police department, your own fire department. You know, you got a paramedic right here." So it's not so, no one sat me down and said, you know, it's 7 minutes as opposed to 9 minutes or whatever the numbers were. It was just this sort of vague perception that people are definitely paying a premium to live in this town, that to have your own police and fire seems to, you know, obviously there's some cost, but it seems to go along with what people might want in this town. So again, it's not really the actual numbers, it's the perception of the service that you have.
Yes.
Hey, Ken, do you think people have the data point that so many of the calls are outbound? Like, we're sending more of our bespoke fire service out of town than we're keeping in Ross. So the premium that we're paying for that is to benefit the larger community outside of Ross. And I don't think that was well understood, at least by me, until I heard it tonight. Because I think of that as, you know, sort of our fire department, but really we serve the larger community. And there's a small component. I think it was something around 20% of the calls are actually in Ross.
But is that reflected in the economics, I wonder? I mean, do we get some sort of credit because we're sending more people out than are coming in?
It's all about the mutual aid. Chief
So,
Weber.
yeah, so, you know, the fire service, we count on each other. And historically, small communities had, you know, maybe even in Ross, 25 volunteers. And if a building caught fire in Ross, whomever, if anybody was on duty, or the first arriving volunteers, and it was rare to call from the outside. And as time progressed, volunteer numbers dwindled. Communities had to rely on each other. And just like Ross, I mean, with the substantial size homes, you couldn't count on 2 people on duty in one fire truck to manage an incident. And so, you know, a first alarm structure fire or a vegetation fire, you know, respectively, is about 6 pieces of equipment or 20 pieces of equipment, including aircraft, depending on the type of incident. So we're all interdependent on each other. And, you know, larger communities like Santa Fe, who has, you know, 6 stations, would still come to Ross when we had a second alarm fire. And it works well. You know, if you tried to say, well, we want compensation for this, then the next person wants compensation for that. And then people stop with mutual aid systems, and you end up in a system that we were in, you know, pre-1980s, where you had to depend on yourself. And that didn't work well. And that's why it's transitioned to this.
I guess
Yes.
maybe the question that I don't understand, and we don't need to get into full fiscal policy here on this call by any stretch, but is just of what I heard in the question was, how are costs shared amongst Kent, in this particular example, amongst Kentfield, Ross, and San Anselmo? If our fire and paramedics were to go to, those, would our, is it by volume? Is it by, in what way are we sharing those costs? And I think that would get to like us understanding like, okay, what's the cost to have this here in our town? And, what's the relative cost to move it out? That's, I think, what I'm trying to get to anyway.
Yeah, and that's something, it's something we're going to have to negotiate with the member agencies, and in Kentfield's case, Allied Agency. What is the associated cost for changing service? And I think there's an expectation from, the administration in Ross that it would not be the same cost as having your own fire station and staffing right in town, that there would be some cost reduction. One of those being insubstantial is the cost of the one-time cost of replacing the facility and any major facility maintenance over time. So that's a net gain, right?
No.
And this piece would be, if that alternative service model is used from a neighboring jurisdiction, would there be an ongoing reduction in service costs annually? And I think the answer is yes. The question is how much, and that's something that has to be negotiated as part of the impacts of this decision.
But doesn't it make sense, at least in some way, to know what those negotiations would be before we decide whether we want to build something or not? I think we've got to, just in passing, it looks like the cart before the horse, because that's a major factor. Looking at everything else that we're talking about, what is the cost savings, or is there a cost savings, or how much of a cost savings? Because the building and doing all of that is another piece, and that has to do with bonds and all kinds of issues and taxes and what might happen. But what is to our city budget, et cetera, what would be the savings if such? And is the savings really worth not having our own, or is the savings really a driver? And we don't know.
So the upfront savings is about $14 million in one-time costs associated with the building itself. And then I think that, if I were to go out on a limb here, and Joe's probably going to yell at me here, but maybe those are $500,000 annually ongoing for service reduction costs. So it's substantial. It's not, and right now I think, and Joe can probably, but I think it's about $2.2 million is the contribution Ross pays Ross Valley Fire Department.
Okay, that's helpful. Thanks for going out on the limb there, Chief. Appreciate it. Okay, so it seems, and I knew we'd get excellent questions, excellent suggestions for more information to convey in order to make an educated decision here. So this is very helpful to kind of frame future conversations. You'll be hearing about a questionnaire that we're going to send out to the community, and we may be able to provide additional information as backgrounder for that. So again, people can make educated opinions. So when we asked about, I posed the question about overall vision. It seems like it's difficult to say that as yet, because we don't know exactly what the programming might be, because some of those opinions depend on additional information to make you feel comfortable in having an opinion. Our next question was really about fire service. How important is it to keep a fire station in Ross? And a lot of our conversation has been playing with, well, hey, we pay a premium. It was part of the expectation. It's part of the draw maybe for moving to Ross. But what are the cost differentials? What's the cost benefit analysis essentially? Other comments or suggestions for additional information on that topic of the level of importance of keeping the station in Ross, just so I can have a few more notes.
I don't think I covered this, and I probably should have. One of the things we looked at is, do we see a potential increase in insurance costs because of the fire station moving? And the answer, the insurance service offices is a private that feeds information into insurance companies, ISO it's called. And in reaching out to them, looking at the information, the proximity of the other fire stations, we don't see there being any substantial change or any change to that weight that's given with ISO for these changes. I think what's more predominant is loss of insurance because of the wildland fire threat. And they're looking specifically at properties and at risks, not necessarily at the fire protection available to it. So I didn't cover that in the first part, and I probably should have.
No, that's very helpful. I'm surprised it wasn't a question because it is a concern. I'm from Sonoma Valley, so I have a lot of experience with wildland fires and insurance and all of that. Okay, so other comments about the fire station being in Ross versus in neighboring communities? Marcia?
I have a question. I'm kind of curious that given, I think the seriousness of fire and the threat of fire has gone up substantially. So this is a different conversation we're having now than we might have had 5 years ago. So I'm kind of curious as to what people are thinking about and taking into consideration about the threat of fire seeming to be so much greater now than it has been in the past. And what does that mean when you think about getting rid of the fire station, and will we have enough coverage if we're, drawing firefighters from other sources? I'm just kind of curious about
Are you putting
that.
that out to the group in general, or did you want Chief to answer that first?
I think probably it's interesting to hear from the group as well as from the chief. So,
Okay.
Sure, great question.
So my feeling about this is that we've heard fire in Ross remains very rare. So while there's an increase, it's like increasing your chance of winning the lottery, right? If you buy 2 tickets, you're twice as likely, but it's still 1 in hundreds of millions. So we had, what did I hear? 3 fires in 2 years. And some of those, I believe, weren't even residences. So again, we've got better fire protection in the residences themselves. The things we hear about wildland fire, while it's very rare to hear of a paradise or a coffee park, what's likely to burn here is when the high voltage lines go down on Mount Tam and burn the wildland. That's not necessarily coming down to the Ross, although embers can come down here and we could certainly have fires and be a threat. It's not like we're seeing an increase in residential areas bursting into flame. So I don't necessarily feel the fear of greater fire threat because of climate change or because of some of the things we've seen recently. I'm very comfortable having a 9-minute response versus a 7:55 response.
Okay, other thoughts on that? And remember, we don't have to come to consensus. How concerned are you about fire coming to Ross?
Yeah, this is Eric Pavelka. I generally concur with Kevin. I think probably there is more, although Kevin might be more educated on this than I have, given some of his background in fire and rescue. But I would generally concur, and I think that the biggest risk is, it's something happening up on Tam that will come down, and if that's the case, for good or for bad, I think we have bigger issues at play that are going to be, not going to be solved by a pea shooter with a fire department. I think that's, I think we'll be in a much bigger mess. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
no offense, Chief Weber, but
A pea shooter. That is good. Well, I think he's upgraded a little bit from the truck that's behind him in his,
Yeah, that's right.
picture there. All right, let me look at my participant group here. Any other comments on having a fire
does
station?
Chief Weber have anything to say about?
Yeah, about that.
So I think when you look at the threat of wildfire, we know our greatest risks are on red flag days, wind events. They're predictable, and we upstaff for those. An example would be the last wind event we just had, and we had 3 additional strike teams, so 15 engines, 2 additional fire crews, which is about 30 people, and an extra bulldozer and some overhead. Ross Valley Fire specifically staffed 2 additional engines. One was part of the strike teams. The other was just as extra staffing because of that event. Additionally, during storm events, floods, again, these are predictable, and we would upstaff accordingly. So I think that would remain still an option to do in those events, and those are predictable. What's not predictable is when we have, you know, 2 structure fires in the same day at the same time in Ross. It's like predicting lightning and where it's going to strike. And when we look at this, the analytics and the data, you know, and I think I may have covered it, but we would expect about 1.5 times a week a call would occur that we have duplicative calls in either Kenfield or San Anselmo. So that 9 minutes, you know, it would depend on which way that engine's coming from. But on average, I think still you'd be looking at that 9+ minute, 9:55 for an average response time.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. That's helpful. Let me see. You know, our next question has to do with your willingness to pay the extra in order to have the fire station in Ross. And it seems like some of you need more information in order to make that choice. Others are leaning towards not having a fire station in Ross, relying on the local neighboring towns. What's your thinking about the additional cost of having a station? Would you prefer not to be taxed at the higher levels in order to have that?
So this is Eric Pavelka. I'm going to put it out there that I do not want to be taxed anymore, period. So so I think that's at the forefront of my mind. And that has not just had to do with Ross, by the way. That is a macro feeling that I'm sure many of us can share. But you know, with that, I did go back and look at the, since we're on the call here, that August meeting, we went through 4 options. I mean, I got to admit, I'm pretty disappointed that there isn't an option 5, 6, or 7 that does say, let's not put a building up. Let's move this, you know, let's move this fire and paramedic off site. What are the things that we can do that don't increase our taxes, but potentially even lower them, right? Like those are the things I think that we need to do as a community, is to, you know, to look at all of the options. And we might choose that those lower cost options aren't the right approach. We need to do something else, but they have to be on the table. The way that this has been presented is, you know, tonight, and as I look back here to this August meeting minutes, is, you know, frankly, I would expect more. Like this is going in with an assumptive close that we have to go ahead and put new buildings up, instead of looking at the totality of options that could be on the table. So I think we have a lot more work to do.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that was Eric.
It was.
Thank you for that. Anyone else want to weigh in on willingness to pay to have the fire station in Ross?
I mean, just to reiterate what has already been said, the slides that were presented, not only do they only show 2 options, but they also only showed the upfront costs. And I think any reasonable business person or taxpayer needs to see not only the difference in the upfront costs, but the annualized difference with some kind of assumptions in the cost on an annual basis if we move the engines to San Anselmo. And that was completely left out of the presentation.
Thank you.
It's really hard to just look at one number and make a decision.
You know, it's interesting, when we were planning this process for the early discussion on this subject, we were thinking about doing the questionnaire first and then the workshop, but we all agreed that we should do the workshop first for this very reason, that we get good suggestions for information that's needed, that, you know, other questions, other approaches. And so this is very helpful. You're almost like a little pre-focus group.
Carolyn, I would suggest that in your questionnaire, you also look at what public safety means to people, because you gave options public safety that were very skewed to the existing perceptions of public safety, fire and medical, right? But where was concerns about flood? So you had another category in there, but, you know, the bigger concerns for people may not be medical response or fire. When they think of public safety, it may be something else entirely, like how they keep their communities safe from flooding.
Yes, I think we were just thinking about the subject at hand, and we need to broaden that out. Thank you, Kevin. Much appreciated.
It's what's most important to public safety. People go, oh, you know, wildfire. It's like, well, you know, that was a pretty limited set of options in the realm of public safety to choose from.
Yeah, thank you.
And Chief Weber, I'm really sympathetic, especially seeing some of the photos of the building. I didn't realize the state of disrepair that it's in. I've been in the fire bays and I've helped you guys out in a couple of things. And I was a member of search and rescue for 12 years. So we've worked together in some of these things. And I had no idea that the building is in the condition that it's in. But as far as this question of more taxation, I look at, the way our current tax bill is broken down, and there's so many services within Ross that are special to Ross. We have to have our own school district, we have to have our own police and fire forces, and now we're looking at this undergrounding project as well that's going to add several $1,000s to tax bills. So when you begin adding these things up, it's really hard to justify yet another a taxable hit, for something over many years that perhaps we could disperse in a different service model. If I was looking at this as a business, I'd say, why are we building our own when this has already been solved in by other communities? Can we buy that service or leverage the good work that's been done there already? Additionally, I'm really curious on your perspective on the firefighters themselves. Like, is it good to have such a small, again, discrete and bespoke force? A career path for a firefighter in Ross seems very limited. Do you really have, some place for people to do the best training, to get the best skills, to feel like they're growing and learning and accomplishing over a 20 to 30-year career with a fire force?
So, yeah, I think when Ross moved, the challenge here with Ross, it's a bedroom community of about 800 parcels.
Right.
So you have a very high level of service. And I think there's been a community desire over time to have, your own services as a community, and you pay for those that enhanced service level, and you only have 800 parcels ish. And Joe can give me the numbers, but to actually tax for these services. So yeah, it's exponentially higher than if you were to spread that out over 10,000 residents and roughly the same square miles as you might see in another community. So that drives your unit costs where it is. And as for the firefighters, I think there's general consensus across the Marin Fire Service that consolidation and things are good, and everybody's supportive of that. The challenge is the disparity in costs for service and service level, across the county. And our neighbors, Kenfield next door, 6,500 residents. Their budget's $6.5 million. They have one fire station. We have about an $11 million budget, have 4 fire stations, and spread out. So you can see the challenges of trying to align all the stars and the fire districts pre-Prop 13, take a big cut of that ad valorem tax base compared to the town of Ross, which has to provide municipal services, police, roads, DPW, fire, for almost the same amount of that cut. And Ross is an example of not a lot of sales tax or other things to fund the city. So that all adds up. But I think that
I'm the first one to argue for a casino at Phoenix Lake here. I think we have the indigenous people reclaim their land, and we put the casino in. That becomes our tax base, and you can build 2 fire stations and train every resident in Ross in CPR.
Yeah, there you go. Good. Great idea.
Carolyn.
That'll go in our notes. All right.
Thanks. You can take that to the town council.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, Richard, what do you have to say?
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? This is Richard Thalheimer.
Thank you.
So I'll just give you my personal observations. And obviously I don't know as much as most of you know, but I'll give you a personal observation, which is, given the incredible difference in cost of moving the fire department or not, and the desire of people today to not want to pay too much in taxes, I'll just make the prediction the town would rather have the fire department move and keep the police department. For the simple reason that you see the police every day, you get to know them, but when your fire breaks out, you're not so connected personally to who the fire department personnel are. And to think that the town would spring for 28 million versus 14 million, I don't think that's going to happen. But that's just my personal opinion. I'm just throwing it out there.
Thank you.
As far as the wisdom of keeping the buildings, keeping the police department inside here, I think people really like that. And if they could stretch and afford it, if they would, I think they really want that, because it's tradition, it's meaningful, It's prestigious for the town. It's been our history. So I'll predict that they'd like that if you could convince them to give up that additional tax or bond cost. That's it.
All right. What about paramedics, Richard?
When you
Paramedic
said
service.
14 to 28, were you talking of moving the paramedic or not?
Joe, that one
So
has
the
paramedics
28
in town.
the 28 includes paramedic in town. The 14 includes paramedic in town, but in a like a modular building on that site.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And so the paramedics was roughly $2.3 million. So is it worth the $2.3 million to have the paramedics here or not?
Well, only because Ken mentioned strokes. I think a lot of people would like to have the paramedics as close as possible, but I have no strong opinion on it.
Richard, do you have any predictions for November 3rd since you've been making predictions?
Yeah, right.
Well, the polls all say that it's going to be a Democratic sweep. We'll see.
We'll see. We'll see. All right. What are other opinions about paramedic service in town? Is that really important to all of you, or do others have different opinions on that? I think Kevin thought we should look at that too as a potential option of drawing on adjacent towns. Any strong opinions?
And just so you know, on this one, it isn't drawing on towns. It's more the paramedics is the same paramedics. It's just, are they located here?
Yes.
Or do they move to Kentfield or San Anselmo to operate out of?
Okay, I see. It would be
So it's not
same,
changing
but-
staffing.
yeah. Okay.
It's just where are they based out of?
Yes, where are they based out of? Okay.
Joe, just a point of clarification. Can they move to Kentfield? Because I thought Kentfield was in its own district, whereas they would need to be part of the Ross Valley district, so they moved to San Anselmo, which is actually further away.
Well, you have the chief executive of the paramedic authority right here in Fire Chief Weber. So
One of my other hats.
yeah,
So
not as many.
the Ross Valley Paramedic Authority is an 8-member JPA through the whole Ross Valley.
Okay.
And it has 2 ambulances, one in Corte Madera, one right now in Ross. Ross is an ideal location from a centralization point, but we have ALS paramedic engine companies on the outstretches to stop that time clock for definitive care services. One of the things that wasn't mentioned is RVPA does pay a lease to the town of Ross. So while they're there and occupying, that would cover some of those costs for that facility. I don't think it would cost cover it, but it would certainly contribute.
Okay, so I actually feel pretty strongly about paramedics, and it's probably for an illogical reason. It's that I believe I have no control over things like a heart attack or a stroke, but I maybe have some control over a fire. I'm not going to smoke. I'm not going to leave my, my stove on. And so because it's unpredictable, I'm willing to pay to have the extra 2 minutes because I think it will matter. So if you were to ask me to prioritize paramedics or fire, I would take paramedics, 99 times out of 100, with no disrespect to fire.
Yeah, we understand. That's great. Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, they're one and the same. They're firefighters also. So
Yeah, they are.
Point taken.
Yeah, that's right. All right. I'd love to hear from some of the people who haven't had a chance to speak or haven't chosen to weigh in here. Anybody care to unmute yourself and let us know what you think? They may be eating. There's just a few who we haven't heard from. Okay. All right. Any further comments or suggestions or questions before we reconvene with a large group?
Yeah, I just have one more comment. I mean, maybe it's a bit of an outlier, but I'll say it for the benefit of the chief. So I was involved about 10 years ago. Some of you may remember, there was a very broad town survey. We had a response rate of about 1/3 of the town, over 500 people. We asked 38 questions. And the question that got the highest score in terms of satisfaction was the fire department. It was the only one that had like 99% of the people were either extremely satisfied or satisfied. So I don't think that any of this discussion has anything to do with, people's like or dislike of the service or the fire department or anything. I just think it's purely economics. And
Yes.
so I hope you take that away from this.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an important community conversation, and it's a community choice, and we recognize the support in the community, especially in Ross, and thank everybody for that.
Good.
Great. That's wonderful. All right, Richard.
I have one more comment on the police, and that is that I was in another discussion about a month ago, and we batted around quite a bit the subject of having other jurisdictions provide our police support. And there was quite a strong feeling against farming that out. People really strongly liked having our own local police force that knows the people, knows the neighborhoods, knows some of the situations that have repeated in the past. So I just want to throw that out, that we haven't touched on that tonight, but there is a fairly strong feeling that people like having people they know being their police force.
Great.
I agree with that, Richard. So sorry, I've been putting my son to sleep, but my name's Carly. I was born and raised in Ross, and so knowing the police